The conductor's hand gripped Dr. James Morrison's shoulder like he was a common criminal. "Sir, you need to come with me. We've had complaints about suspicious behavior." And just like that, a tenured professor of African American Studies at Westfield University, a man who'd published 6 books and taught thousands of students over 20 years, was being escorted off an Amtrak train in front of 100 passengers who watched with that familiar mixture of curiosity, discomfort, and silent complicity, but suspicious of what? Reading academic journals, sipping coffee, existing while black in the quiet car? Dr. Morrison, 52 years old with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a university sweater and khakis, carrying a leather satchel full of student papers he was grading on his way back from a conference in Boston, looked at Conductor Williams, a white man in his 40s with that particular brand of authority that comes from a uniform and the assumption that he's always right, and asked the question he already knew wouldn't be answered honestly. "What suspicious behavior?" "I've been sitting quietly reading for 2 hours. What exactly did I do?" But Conductor Williams wasn't interested in specifics, wasn't interested in evidence. He was interested in exercising power, in responding to a complaint from a passenger who'd apparently decided that a black man in the quiet car, even one clearly marked as faculty, even one doing nothing but existing peacefully, must be up to something, must be dangerous, must be removed for everyone's safety and comfort. Because that's how this works. That's how it's always worked. Suspicion as a proxy for racism. Safety concerns as cover for segregation. The other passengers started paying attention now. A young white woman in her 20s looked up from her laptop. A middle-aged white couple exchanged glances. A Latino businessman put down his phone. And an elderly black woman 3 rows back closed her eyes like she'd seen this movie before and knew exactly how it ended. Because it's a script written in America's DNA. Performed daily on trains and planes and streets and classrooms, and everywhere black people dare to occupy space without permission, without apology, without making themselves small enough to be unthreatening. "I'd like to know who made this complaint and what specifically they said," Dr. Morrison stated, his voice carrying that professor's authority, that tone he used in lectures when challenging students to think critically, to question assumptions, to demand evidence. But Conductor Williams shook his head, tightened his grip, and said with finality that left no room for discussion, "That's confidential, sir. Now you can either come voluntarily or I'll have transit police remove you at the next stop." The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Because everyone on that train knew what transit police meant, what removal meant. What could happen to a black man who resisted even wrongful authority? The names that flashed through everyone's mind, Eric Garner, George Floyd, the countless others whose encounters with power ended in tragedy, in hashtags, in movements that changed nothing and everything simultaneously. Dr. Morrison took a deep breath, the kind of breath that holds back decades of this exact situation, of being questioned in his own office by campus security who didn't believe he was faculty, of being followed in stores, of having police called when he went jogging in his own neighborhood, of living in a body that society treats as inherently suspicious, regardless of credentials, accomplishments, or character. And he said with controlled precision, "I am Dr. James Morrison, tenured professor at Westfield University. I'm traveling home from an academic conference where I delivered the keynote address on systemic racism in American institutions. And the irony of this moment is not lost on me. But I will comply under protest, and I want your badge number, your full name, and the complaint details in writing." Conductor Williams bristled at this, at the audacity of a passenger, a black passenger. Let's be clear. Demanding accountability, demanding documentation, demanding to be treated like a human being with rights rather than a problem to be solved. And he responded with that classic deflection. "Sir, your attitude is making this situation worse. If you just cooperate instead of being difficult, we could resolve this quickly." Ah yes, the tone argument, the civility demand, the expectation that victims of injustice should perform gratitude for their own mistreatment, should smile while being dehumanized, should make their oppressors comfortable while being oppressed. Because apparently the problem wasn't the false accusation, wasn't the racial profiling, wasn't the public humiliation, but rather Dr. Morrison's insufficient enthusiasm for his own persecution. As they moved toward the door between train cars, passengers started reacting. The young white woman pulled out her phone and started recording. The elderly black woman called out, "This is wrong. Leave that man alone." And a white man in a business suit, we'll call him Michael Stevens, a lawyer heading home to Hartford, stood up and said, "Excuse me, I've been in this car the whole time. This gentleman has done absolutely nothing suspicious. What's the actual complaint?" But Conductor Williams wasn't interested in witnesses. Wasn't interested in truth, he was interested in maintaining his authority. In winning this confrontation, he'd already decided to have, and he told Michael, "Sir, sit down, or you'll be removed as well." Which is the thing about challenging injustice in real time. It requires courage. It requires risk. It requires being willing to become a target yourself. And most people, no matter how sympathetic, aren't willing to cross that line. But Michael Stevens, to his credit, didn't sit down. He followed them toward the door, still recording on his phone, still documenting, still bearing witness. When they reached the space between cars, Conductor Williams finally revealed what this was really about. "A passenger reported that you were acting agitated, pacing and looking at other passengers in a threatening manner. And given the current climate, we have to take all security concerns seriously." Dr. Morrison almost laughed, because he hadn't paced anywhere, hadn't looked at anyone beyond the normal brief eye contact people make in public spaces, hadn't been agitated about anything except his students' persistent confusion about the difference between Jim Crow and Jane Crow laws. But here's the thing about accusations against black people. They don't need to be true. They don't need to be specific. They don't need to be substantiated. They just need to exist. They just need to be spoken. And suddenly the burden of proof shifts. Suddenly you're guilty until proven innocent. Suddenly your innocence requires evidence, while accusations require only melanin and proximity. "What current climate?" Dr. Morrison asked, his professor instincts kicking in. His need to make people articulate their assumptions, to drag implicit bias into explicit light, to make racism explain itself, and Conductor Williams stammered, realizing he'd revealed more than intended, that he'd pulled back the curtain on the fear-mongering and stereotyping that masqueraded as security protocol. And he recovered with, "You know what I mean. We have to be careful. Better safe than sorry. Better safe than sorry," the motto of racial profiling. The excuse for treating entire communities as threats, the logic that says one person's comfort matters more than another person's dignity, that false accusations against black people are acceptable collateral damage in the war against whatever phantom threat racism has conjured this week, this month, this century. Michael Stevens, still recording, interjected again. "I'm an attorney, and what you're describing is textbook racial profiling. This man has committed no crime, violated no train policy, and you're removing him based on a completely unsubstantiated complaint that appears to be racially motivated. So unless you can provide specific observable behavior that violates stated rules, you're opening yourself and Amtrak to significant legal liability." The legal threat registered on Conductor Williams's face. That flicker of doubt, that moment where power realizes it might have consequences, but he'd gone too far to back down now, had committed too fully to this course of action, and with all the passengers watching, with phones recording, with witnesses multiplying, he couldn't afford to look wrong, couldn't afford to admit error, so he doubled down. Because that's what people do when their authority is challenged and their judgment is questioned. They escalate. They entrench. They choose pride over justice every single time. "Sir, I need you to step off at the next station. You can file a complaint with Amtrak customer service, but my decision is final," Conductor Williams announced. And you could hear it in his voice, that desperation dressed as authority, that fear wrapped in regulation, and Dr. Morrison, recognizing the futility of arguing with someone more committed to being right than doing right, asked one more question. "Will I be allowed to reboard? Will I receive a refund? Will there be any documentation of this incident?" These practical questions, these attempts to salvage something from this injustice, these efforts to create accountability in a system designed to avoid it, and Conductor Williams, probably realizing he hadn't thought this through, mumbled something about talking to station management, about filing reports, about procedures that both of them knew would lead nowhere, protect no one except the institution. and resolve nothing except removing Dr. Morrison from the discomfort of whoever complained. The train began slowing, approaching. New Haven Station, and Michael Stevens handed Dr. Morrison a business card. "I witnessed everything. I've recorded everything. Call me. I'll represent you pro bono if you want to pursue this." And there it was. That moment of solidarity, that choice to not just witness injustice, but to actively oppose it, to offer resources, to become an ally in deed rather than just in sympathetic silence. And Dr. Morrison took the card, nodded his thanks, and prepared to be escorted off the train like a criminal, like a threat, like someone who'd done something wrong when his only crime was reading while black, existing while black, daring to occupy space while black. As Dr. Morrison stepped onto the platform at New Haven, carrying his satchel, his dignity, and his barely contained rage, the other passengers who'd witnessed the incident started posting to social media. The young woman tweeted the video with racial profiling. Michael Stevens posted to his law firm's Instagram with a detailed account. The elderly black woman called her daughter, who worked in local news. And within 30 minutes, the story was spreading, the video was viral, and the internet was doing what it does best: documenting injustice, amplifying voices, creating accountability through collective outrage. But Dr. Morrison didn't know this yet, standing on that platform, checking his phone to find alternative transportation, calling his wife to explain why he'd be late, trying to process the humiliation, the anger, the exhaustion of having to explain once again that yes, this still happens, yes, in 2024, yes, to people with PhDs and university positions and every marker of respectability politics that was supposed to protect us but never does, because racism doesn't care about credentials, doesn't read CVs, doesn't check resumes before deciding who looks suspicious and who looks safe. He made one more call to someone who needed to know, someone who would care, someone whose response would matter. Dr. Patricia Chen, the president of Westfield University, a Chinese-American woman who'd made her career studying institutional discrimination and who'd been vocal about the university's commitment to social justice, who'd hired Dr. Morrison specifically to build their African American Studies program into something meaningful, something real, something that didn't just talk about racism in textbooks but challenged it in practice. "Patricia," he said when she answered, his voice finally betraying the emotion he'd held back. "I need to tell you what just happened, and I need to know if the university is going to have my back on this." He recounted the whole incident, every detail, every moment, every injustice. And on the other end of the line, Patricia Chen listened in growing horror, growing anger, growing determination. Because this wasn't just about one professor. This wasn't just about one incident. This was about whether institutions mean what they say when they talk about diversity and inclusion and standing against racism, or whether those are just words on websites and brochures, marketing materials that evaporate the moment they require courage, cost money, or challenge power. "James," she said, and he could hear something in her voice, something that made him stand a little straighter on that platform, something that sounded like solidarity turning into strategy. "You are not alone in this. The university stands with you, and I promise you, Amtrak is about to learn what institutional accountability actually looks like." Within an hour, Dr. Chen had convened an emergency meeting with the university's legal team, communications department, and board of trustees, explaining that one of their most respected faculty members had been racially profiled and removed from public transportation, that the incident was documented on video, that it was spreading on social media, and that Westfield University needed to make a clear, unequivocal statement about where they stood, not the usual corporate non-statement, not the "we're gathering facts" deflection, not the all parties, both sides-ism that treats racism as a difference of opinion rather than a violation of dignity, but an actual statement with actual teeth and actual consequences. The university's response came swift and public. A statement released on all official channels within 3 hours of the incident, and it wasn't the tepid, carefully lawyered statement most institutions produce when faced with controversy. It was a declaration of war disguised as a press release. Westfield University is appalled by the treatment of Dr. James Morrison, our distinguished professor of African American Studies, who was removed from an Amtrak train today based solely on racial profiling and unsubstantiated accusations. Dr. Morrison is a valued member of our academic community, a scholar of international reputation, and a human being who deserves to travel without harassment. We are demanding a full investigation by Amtrak, immediate policy reforms, mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, and financial compensation for Dr. Morrison. Furthermore, until these demands are met, Westfield University is suspending all contracts with Amtrak, including our group travel arrangements. And we are encouraging our 15,000 students, faculty, and staff to choose alternative transportation. Racism is not a customer service issue. It is a civil rights violation, and institutions that enable it will be held accountable. The statement exploded across social media, picked up by news outlets within the hour, and suddenly this wasn't just about Dr. Morrison. It was about institutional responsibility, about corporate accountability, about what it costs when universities actually back up their diversity statements with action rather than just words. Other universities started releasing their own statements, some supporting Westfield's stance, some carefully distancing themselves because bold positions require courage they didn't possess. And within 24 hours, 5 more universities had suspended their Amtrak contracts. Student organizations were organizing boycotts, and Amtrak's PR department was in full crisis mode, issuing statements about taking the incident seriously, promising investigations, offering the usual corporate apologies that sound sincere until you realize they're designed by committees to admit nothing while appearing to care about everything. But Dr. Chen wasn't finished. Because statements are one thing, action is another, and she understood that performative allyship dies in press releases while real solidarity requires sacrifice, requires risk, requires putting institutional resources where institutional values claim to be. She personally called Dr. Morrison that evening, asked how he was doing beyond the professional, beyond the incident, checking on his emotional state, his family, his well-being, treating him like a human being rather than a PR problem to manage, and she told him something that would become famous in academic circles. "James, I want you to know that when I took this job, I made a promise to myself that I would never ask someone to face racism alone, that I would never let institutional neutrality become institutional complicity, and that promise includes you, includes this moment, includes whatever comes next." What came next was a legal filing, because Michael Stevens, the lawyer from the train, had meant what he said about pro bono representation, and within a week, he'd filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Amtrak on Dr. Morrison's behalf, citing racial discrimination, violation of civil rights, emotional distress, and a pattern of discriminatory practices that the lawsuit documented through dozens of similar incidents reported over the past 5 years. Incidents where black passengers had been removed, questioned, harassed based on nothing more than other passengers' comfort levels and conductors' biases. The lawsuit demanded policy changes, training reforms, independent oversight, and yes, financial compensation. Not because money fixes racism, but because institutions respond to costs. They respond to liability. They respond to consequences that affect their bottom line in ways they never respond to moral arguments about dignity and justice. Conductor Williams found himself suspended pending investigation. And the investigation revealed what investigations often reveal when people actually look: a history of complaints, a pattern of disproportionately questioning black passengers, multiple incidents where he'd exercised his authority in ways that seemed reasonable to him, but discriminatory to everyone else. And suddenly his 20 years of service looked less like dedication and more like 2 decades of unchecked bias operating with institutional permission. Because that's the thing about systemic racism. It's not always individual villains making conscious choices to harm. It's often ordinary people operating within systems that train them, encourage them, protect them when they treat certain populations as inherently suspicious, inherently dangerous, inherently less deserving of benefit of the doubt. The passenger who'd made the original complaint, a white woman named Jennifer Hartley, was identified through the investigation, and when reporters tracked her down, she gave an interview that perfectly captured the cognitive dissonance of racism. "I didn't mean for him to be kicked off the train. I just felt uncomfortable. He seemed agitated. And I thought I was doing the right thing by reporting my concerns. I'm not racist. I have black friends. I just wanted to feel safe. There it was. The entire architecture of modern racism in 3 sentences. The discomfort disguised as cost of someone else's dignity. That her feeling safe required making him unsafe. That her unexamined bias had real consequences for a real human being whose life was disrupted, whose reputation was questioned, whose humanity was denied because she felt uncomfortable. The story became a teaching moment. Not just about this incident, but about the larger patterns. The everyday racism that operates in the language of safety and concern, that hides behind procedures and protocols, that turns subjective feelings into objective threats. And Dr. Morrison, once the dust settled a bit, once the immediate crisis passed, found himself doing what professors do, teaching, using this experience as curriculum, writing an op-ed for the New York Times titled The Pedagogy of Profiling, What I Learned. Being thrown off a train, where he broke down the incident sociologically, historically, intersectionally, connecting his personal experience to larger systems of power, privilege and racial surveillance, and the op-ed went viral because it wasn't angry. Anger would have been justified but dismissed. It was analytical. It was educational. It was the kind of measured, evidence-based argument that's harder to dismiss, that forces readers to confront their own assumptions about who deserves suspicion and who deserves benefit of doubt. Amtrak eventually settled the lawsuit. The terms confidential, but including substantial compensation for Dr. Morrison, mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, creation of a passenger rights ombudsman position specifically to handle discrimination complaints, and quarterly reporting on passenger complaints disaggregated by race to identify patterns and hold the company accountable. And while no settlement fixes systemic racism, while no policy change erases the harm of the original incident, it created structures that might prevent the next Dr. Morrison, might protect the next black passenger, might make one small part of one institution slightly less dangerous for people whose bodies are treated as threats simply for existing. But here's what matters most. Here's what the skeptics and the why does everything have to be about race crowd need to understand. Dr. James Morrison didn't wake up that morning looking to become a civil rights case study, didn't board that train hoping to experience racism so he could prove it still exists. He just wanted to grade papers, drink mediocre coffee, and get home to his family. The most mundane desires, the most ordinary goals, and he couldn't even do that without his humanity being questioned, his presence being challenged, his right to occupy space being revoked based solely on someone else's unexamined bias and irrational fear. The university president's response, Dr. Chen's immediate, unequivocal support, stands in stark contrast to how most institutions handle these situations, with their committees and their investigations and their both sides statements that never actually take sides, that never actually declare that racism is wrong, full stop, no qualifications, no caveats, no waiting for all the facts when the facts are recorded on video and witnessed by dozens. This is what institutional allyship looks like when it's real, when it costs something, when it requires sacrifice. Westfield University lost their Amtrak contract, lost convenience, lost ease, but they gained something more valuable: credibility, moral authority, the trust of faculty and students who now knew that diversity statements weren't just recruitment tools, but actual commitments the institution would defend even when inconvenient, even when expensive, even when it would be easier to issue a statement and move on. Conductor Williams lost his job, not because one incident, but because the investigation revealed a pattern, revealed a career's worth of small injustices that accumulated into systemic discrimination. And some will say that's unfair, that he didn't deserve to lose his livelihood. That cancel culture has gone too far. But here's the question. How many passengers did he profile? How many black people did he question, harass, remove based on nothing but bias? How many people's trips, days, dignity did he disrupt before someone finally held him accountable? Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice applied is always going to look harsh to those who've operated without accountability for so long they've mistaken privilege for rights. Jennifer Hartley, the woman who made the complaint, became a different kind of case study, the face of well-meaning racism, of bias that doesn't wear hoods or burn crosses but still causes harm, still perpetuates injustice, still requires black people to navigate white discomfort as if it's their responsibility to manage other people's fears and feelings, and her interview, her defense, her inability to see herself as part of the problem, it all went viral too, used in diversity trainings, in sociology classes, in conversations about how racism operates when people who insist they're not racist still engage in racist behavior, still trust their biases more than evidence, still prioritize their comfort over others' rights. This story, like all stories of racism in America, doesn't have a neat ending, doesn't resolve cleanly, doesn't offer the satisfaction of permanent solutions. Because Dr. Morrison might have won this battle, but the war continues. He might have received compensation, but he still lives in a body that society treats with suspicion. He might have institutional support now, but he'll board another train, another plane, another public space, and wonder if today is the day someone decides he looks suspicious again. If today is the day someone's unfounded fear becomes his problem, if today is the day he has to prove once again that he has the right to exist peacefully in public. So when you travel, when you see someone and feel that flutter of discomfort, that whisper of suspicion, ask yourself, is this person actually doing anything wrong? Or am I responding to bias, to stereotype, to the racist narratives society has fed us about whose bodies are dangerous and whose bodies are safe? Before you make a complaint, before you call security, before you decide someone looks suspicious, examine your assumptions. Question your discomfort. Recognize that your feelings are not facts, and your fear does not justify someone else's humiliation. This is Axiom USA, bringing you stories of injustice, resilience, and the ongoing fight for dignity in spaces that should be neutral but never are. If this story resonated with you, if you've experienced your own train platform moment, if you've been profiled or questioned or removed for no reason except existing while black, share it in the comments, hit that subscribe button, and let's keep documenting these stories because silence protects perpetrators while speaking up protects future victims. Change doesn't come from individual incidents. It comes from patterns recognized, from stories shared, from institutions held accountable, from people like Dr. Chen, who choose solidarity over safety, from lawyers like Michael Stevens who record when it would be easier to look away, from communities that refuse to let these moments be forgotten, dismissed, or minimized. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and remember, we all have choices in moments of injustice. We can be Jennifer Hartley reporting unfounded suspicions. We can be Conductor Williams enforcing bias disguised as policy. We can be the silent passengers who witness and do nothing. Or we can be Michael Stevens recording and supporting. We can be Dr. Chen demanding accountability. We can be the change that makes the next train ride, the next public space, the next moment of existence a little bit safer, a little bit more a little bit more human for everyone regardless of the color of their skin. Justice isn't a destination, it's a practice. It's a choice we make every day, in every interaction, in every moment when we decide whether someone's discomfort matters more than someone else's dignity. And until we all choose dignity, until we all choose justice, until we all choose to see each other as human beings deserving of respect rather than threats to be managed or problems to be solved, stories like Dr. Morrison's will keep happening. Keep being documented, keep demanding that we do better, be better, choose better. This is Axiom USA, and we're not done telling these stories until we don't have to anymore.